Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
There's something deeply satisfying about watching people realize, slowly and painfully, that they're in over their heads. It's not about schadenfreude, it's about justice, about balance. I didn't cause the system to fail. I just stopped holding it up. The truth is, I never wanted it to come to this. I would have preferred to walk away and let them learn the hard way without any interference from me. But when they tried to erase my name, when they decided to rewrite the story and cast themselves as the architects of a future they didn't build, that's when it became personal. They were playing house in a structure I designed, furnished, and maintained, and they had the nerve to act like they'd just moved into a turnkey masterpiece. Well, let's see how they handle the plumbing, because if you know anything about systems, you know that when the ghost of the architect still lives in the wiring, the whole house listens differently, and sometimes it moans. The problem with modern leadership, the kind that shows up with polished resumes and freshly printed business cards, is that it often mistakes visibility for control. These new executives, they move fast, talk big, and rely heavily on dashboards they barely understand, throwing around words like efficiency, digital transformation, and low-hanging fruit, as if they're spells that will summon results without ever touching the infrastructure underneath. Madison Lang, for all her boardroom polish and TED Talk cadence, had no clue how the company actually worked, and over time, I realized she wasn't just fumbling through the chaos, she was actively painting over it with so much spin that no one could see the rot beneath. But rot has a smell, and I decided it was time someone turned up the heat to let it rise. I wasn't going to destroy anything. That wasn't my style. Besides, taking a hammer to something I'd built with care over 2 decades wouldn't be satisfying. It would be pathetic. No, what I wanted was clarity. I wanted the board, the investors, the staff, all of them to see the cracks they'd ignored when they let her usher me out the door. And to do that, I needed to expose just how deeply she misunderstood the engine she was trying to drive. I needed a canary in the code, something subtle, something defensible, something that would echo loudly if ignored. It started with a dormant script I'd written years ago, back when we were automating system maintenance across regions and needed a way to simulate load without risking uptime. It was a clever little tool designed to mimic normal usage patterns and stress test the response time of critical APIs during off hours. Back then, it was triggered manually, usually by me or one of the senior devs during a controlled maintenance window. I dusted it off, adjusted the parameters, rewired its triggers to respond to real-time usage thresholds, and activated it remotely. What this did was simple. When a particular API call exceeded a certain volume, the script would initiate a sequence of lightweight, randomized test calls across legacy endpoints. Nothing malicious, nothing damaging, just enough to tip the system into exposing its vulnerabilities. Think of it like tugging on the edges of a spider web to see which parts hold and which threads snap. Within 24 hours of activation, the client dashboard started throwing minor errors, just enough for customer support to notice and file a ticket, but not enough to cause alarm at the executive level. That was the first ripple. The second came 2 days later during an investor presentation where Madison was demonstrating real-time analytics improvements. The dashboard she was using, still tethered to the legacy data aggregator, began to freeze intermittently. Nothing crashed, but the delays were long enough to make her fumble. Word reached me indirectly through a friend in IT who texted, "You watching this mess?" I was. I watched everything. The best part wasn't that the errors were happening. It was that on paper they were entirely explainable. The code hadn't been changed maliciously. The logs, if anyone bothered to check, would show perfectly valid calls being made by what appeared to be internal automation. The issue wasn't the activity itself, it was the lack of resilience in the system. The exact kind of thing Madison had dismissed as legacy noise when she began cutting what she called redundant processes. Redundancy, of course, being the thing that keeps systems from collapsing under unexpected load. Her arrogance had created the perfect environment for a demonstration, and the code did the rest. That week, 3 departments filed internal reviews to understand why reports were taking longer to load. A 4th department raised a red flag about conflicting datasets in client reports, and a 5th simply stopped responding to queries altogether after their dependency on a deprecated endpoint led to a recursive loop of failed calls. In technical terms, it was a mess. In political terms, it was a small explosion. But what made it beautiful was that no one could point a finger. There was no breach, no vandalism, no obvious saboteur, just a cascade of issues that revealed how fragile the new infrastructure had become once the people who understood its design were no longer around to hold it together. I kept my fingerprints off everything. No logins from unusual IPs, no admin overrides, no backdoors used. Everything I'd set in motion operated within the parameters of the system as it had always existed. If someone had simply maintained the protocols, if someone had actually learned the architecture instead of replacing it with buzzwords, none of it would have happened. But they didn't, and it did, and now the board was paying attention. An emergency meeting was called late on a Thursday evening. Again, this came to me through whispers and fragments. Madison apparently had tried to spin the outages as growing pains, part of the evolutionary cycle of digital innovation, whatever that meant. But too many departments were complaining now. Clients were calling, support queues were backing up. Someone on the board, likely one of the old guard who remembered the early days, began to ask questions about system integrity and risk management. The panic was beginning to set in, and there I was, in the shadows, not gloating, not cackling, just observing. Because the goal wasn't revenge, it was awareness. I wasn't trying to burn it all down. I was trying to force a moment of truth, a point where they would have to look past the polished slide decks and realize that the foundation they were betting on was only stable because someone had spent 20 years learning how to reinforce it without fanfare. There's something ironic about the way corporate structures work. They love to talk about data, about transparency, about tracking every possible metric to optimize performance. But when it comes to leadership, they often go with gut instincts, shiny resumes, and whatever sounds good in a quarterly report. They value newness over knowledge, flash over function. And when things go wrong, they scramble not to fix the system, but to find someone to blame. That was the next step I'd prepared for, because soon they'd start looking. And when they did, all signs would point inward, not outward. Not to a disgruntled ex-employee, but to the policies and decisions that led them here. I'd left a trail, not of sabotage, but of accountability, one that, if followed correctly, would lead not to me, but to Madison Lang and the decisions she made while everyone else applauded her for disrupting the norm. It was almost poetic in its own quiet way, and it wasn't over, not yet. Because systems, like people, don't break all at once. They erode, they fracture, they shift just slightly until the weight is too much and something gives. And I had a feeling the next break was coming soon. The meeting that finally broke the surface happened 2 weeks after the investor demo fell apart. According to the scattered accounts I managed to piece together through my still loyal network of quietly disillusioned employees, the board had called Madison in for what was initially billed as a routine operational review, though no one involved was naive enough to believe that. There had been too many failures, too many small cracks that, once ignored, had grown into visible fractures. Clients were beginning to notice inconsistencies in reporting, service response times were dropping, and internal departments had started to point fingers at one another, desperate to shift blame and protect what little ground they had left under them. And, in the midst of it all, stood Madison, still spinning stories, still smiling, still trying to sell the narrative that innovation always comes with friction, that disruption requires a little bit of chaos before it settles into brilliance. But the chaos hadn't settled. It had multiplied. It had taken root because nobody in that leadership circle understood what had actually been holding the operation together in the first place. And when systems built on institutional memory start to falter, it's not code or policy that fixes them. It's the people who remember why the code looked that way to begin with, who know which strange patch from 2011 is still critical and why removing it without context will collapse the entire stack like a house of cards. Unfortunately for Madison, those people had been systematically erased, ignored, or pushed out. And the one person who could have warned them was already sipping his morning coffee at home, logged into a monitoring terminal with no intention of saving them from the collapse they so confidently orchestrated. The meeting, from what I heard, started civil. Madison came prepared with charts, glossy decks, and bullet-pointed projections showing how the company was still moving toward a scalable, cloud-native architecture. She spoke in the polished language of someone who had practiced every sentence in front of a mirror. But then came the questions she hadn't anticipated. A board member, someone who had been around long enough to recognize when the numbers stopped matching the reality, asked why several long-standing clients had missed service level agreements in the past month. Another board member who had received a direct complaint from a partner about report discrepancies asked why internal quality assurance had flagged anomalies that were still unresolved. And most damning of all, someone finally asked why the system logs showed administrative scripts being triggered by an unknown internal process, one that had never been formally documented. That question cracked the floor open. Madison apparently had no answer. She blamed legacy automation. She blamed transitional turbulence. She even, at one point, blamed the IT department for failing to keep up with protocol documentation. But when the CTO was brought in to explain why none of the new systems had safeguards against these inconsistencies, his answer was damning in its own right. Because we assumed those systems were deprecated. That phrase, spoken aloud in front of the board, reportedly caused a silence long enough for someone to refill their water glass in full without interruption. It was only then that someone in the room remembered to ask a different kind of question, the kind no one had asked in 6 months. They asked, simply, who designed those legacy systems? And in that moment, I was there. Not physically, of course. I hadn't set foot in the building since the day I'd been escorted out like a threat to national security. But my name came up again, not as a scapegoat or a suspect, but as a missing piece. Someone in that room had finally realized that the structure they'd torn down had not been abandoned because it was weak. It had been abandoned because they didn't understand how strong it actually was, or how carefully it had been built to hold together under pressure. And now, under their pressure, it was cracking in all the predictable places. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply leaned back in my chair, watched the log entries flicker on my screen, and waited for the next inevitable move. It came 2 days later in the form of a quiet phone call from a blocked number. I didn't pick up. I knew who it was. I knew they'd try to pull me back in, not out of respect or remorse, but because they needed the guy who had the map to the maze they'd set on fire. They would offer consulting fees, promises of autonomy, maybe even a public gesture to save face. But I wasn't interested in being their safety net anymore. I had already spent more years than I should have sacrificing weekends, missing family dinners, and tying my value to an institution that proved it would forget me the moment I was no longer useful. Madison didn't last. By the end of the quarter, she had transitioned into a new opportunity, a phrase so commonly used in those circles that it has lost all meaning. The board brought in an interim COO, someone older, someone quieter, someone with a background in systems engineering instead of branding. They began auditing the infrastructure. They hired back a few of the quieter veterans who had been pushed aside in the last restructure. My name, from what I hear, still comes up occasionally in meetings. Not out of reverence, but out of necessity, the way you mention the original architect of a cathedral when the roof starts to leak, and nobody can figure out why. I didn't break the company. I just stopped holding it together. Maybe that sounds petty. Maybe it is. But what they did to me wasn't just about one man losing a job. It was about a culture that believes experience can be replaced by enthusiasm, that wisdom can be swapped out for trendiness, and that loyalty is less important than optics. I gave them more than years. I gave them the kind of knowledge you can't write down, the kind that lives in your bones after solving the same problem 100 different ways because no one else could be bothered to understand it. And in the end, all I left behind were footprints in the code, just enough to remind them that someone had been there, someone who knew what he was doing, someone who didn't need to scream when he was shown the door. I simply faded into the background like a ghost in the logs, watching, listening, and waiting for the moment they'd realize what they'd done. Because the thing about ghosts is, they're only scary if you remember what you did to make them linger. And in that building, surrounded by shiny new workflows and forgotten history, I think they finally remembered. I was standing outside the glass doors of the only company I'd ever really given a damn about, still holding the stupid foam core farewell poster they handed me with about as much sincerity as a vending machine apology. You know the kind. Everyone signs it with quick scribbles like, "Good luck," and "Stay in touch." Even though you both know you won't. My badge had just been disabled. The security guys were still hovering behind me like I might sprint back in and set the servers on fire. And the new CEO, Madison Lang, 34, MBA from somewhere that charges more for parking than I paid for college, was already back in her glass box office, probably patting herself on the back for a job well done. Just 30 minutes earlier, I was sitting across from her in the conference room I used to run. We were mid-sentence about Q3 implementation timelines when she pulled a thin folder out of her bag like she was about to pitch a PowerPoint deck. And instead, she looked at me with a rehearsed softness and said, "We're going to be making some changes. The board thinks it's time for younger leadership to take us into the next chapter." I blinked at her for maybe 3 seconds before I even understood what was happening. 6 months. That's how long I'd been training her. I had taken every scrap of documentation I ever wrote and rewrote it to fit her management style. I gave her access to the brain of the company, mine, and walked her through every single operational quirk like a proud uncle showing off a homemade train set. I made her look good. Hell, I made her sound like she knew what she was doing, even when she didn't. And in return, she gave me a printed out severance packet and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then came the kicker. After that speech and that smirk, the one that told me she thought she'd played me like a fiddle, she motioned toward the door, and in walked 2 security guys who looked like they'd been pulled off mall patrol. No HR rep, no goodbye from the board, just a brisk, clean break. I was escorted through the main floor like some kind of internal threat, while employees I'd mentored pretended not to notice, suddenly fascinated by their monitors or disappearing into fake phone calls. I said nothing. I didn't yell or argue or even ask for an explanation. I just smiled, tight and polite, shook her hand, and walked out. Because here's the thing. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to make a scene. I just needed time. See, in the 6 months I was grooming her to sit in my chair, she and the board had completely overlooked one critical detail. The system that ran our legacy client infrastructure, the one they always said they'd sunset next year, but never actually did, was something I'd built from scratch back in the early 2000s. It was old, clunky, and probably 3 coffee spills away from dying. But it worked, and it wasn't tied into the new single sign-on ecosystem. It had its own admin portal, its own logging system, and best of all, no one else knew it still existed except me and one guy in dev who left in 2018. They never removed my access. They never even asked about it. So when I got home that evening, still in my dress shirt, tie undone, I didn't pour a whiskey or go for a long, reflective walk in the woods. I sat down in my home office, the same place I'd worked late nights for this company more times than I could count, opened up my laptop and logged into the system they forgot about. And there it was, still alive, still humming, waiting. This wasn't about revenge. Not yet. At that point, I didn't even know what I wanted. Maybe I just wanted to see what they'd do. Maybe I wanted to see if they'd trip over themselves without me there to hold the duct tape. But a part of me, the part that had spent over 2 decades putting out fires, fixing other people's messes, and keeping things moving without ever asking for credit, that part of me wanted to know if they'd even notice I was gone. Spoiler, they wouldn't. Not right away. Madison would smile and sit in her corner office, and the board would nod and talk about synergy and fresh perspectives. They'd look at graphs and projections, not people, not the people who built those graphs with 2 a.m. pizza runs and missed anniversaries. They'd act like the history didn't matter, like the old guy was just part of the furniture, outdated, replaceable, and frankly in the way. So I waited, I watched, I started paying attention to how they moved without me. And in that waiting, in that silence, something started to shift inside me. Not bitterness, no, that's too easy. Something colder, cleaner, like a plan forming, like chess pieces sliding into place. They thought I was gone, but I was still in the system, still watching. And unlike Madison Lang, I knew where all the wires were buried. Let me ask you something. If someone trained their replacement for 6 months, gave them every tool they needed to succeed, and still got tossed like a broken stapler, what would you do? Because I'll tell you this, I didn't scream, I didn't burn anything down. I just smiled and started taking notes. The Monday after they let me go, I did something I hadn't done in years. I slept in. No alarm, no mental checklist waiting for me before my feet even hit the floor, no early morning logins to check if the overnight batch processes failed. I sat at the kitchen table in my robe while my wife, who had witnessed my 2-decade relationship with that company like a long-term third wheel, made coffee in silence. She didn't ask me how I was feeling, which I appreciated more than she'll ever know. We'd been through enough that she could tell when I needed time to chew on something before I spoke. Instead, she just placed a cup in front of me, kissed my forehead, and left me alone with the quiet hum of a house that suddenly felt too big, too still. For 22 years, that company had been a second home, sometimes more of one than my actual home. I watched it grow from a cluttered startup in a strip mall office to a glass and steel downtown tower with catered lunches and meditation rooms nobody used. I was there before the IPO, before the first acquisition, before we even had departments with proper names. I watched fresh out of college hires turn into team leads, watched 3 CEOs come and go, each with a slightly different buzzword-filled vision of the future. And through all of it, I kept things running, quietly, reliably. Like plumbing, you only notice it when it breaks. They used to call me the last original, a half-joking nickname that felt more like respect in the early days and more like a liability by the end. I wore it like a badge anyway. I was the guy who knew the quirks in the codebase no one dared touch. I was the guy who remembered why a line of back-end logic was written that way in 2007 because the founder had a weird thing about email parsing. I was the guy you called at 11 p.m. when the third-party APIs failed and your boss was breathing down your neck for a fix. Not because it was my job, but because I cared, because I believed in the thing we were building, even when it stopped believing in me. That belief died slowly. It didn't vanish all at once when Madison handed me that folder. It started to decay the first time I sat in a meeting where my name didn't come up after presenting a solution. The CTO ended up rephrasing as his own. It faded a little more every time someone half my age, with a third of my experience, got promoted based on LinkedIn charisma and a TED Talk vocabulary. And by the time I was pulled into weekly check-ins that felt more like obituaries for my relevance, I knew the clock was ticking. But knowing it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. What got me, more than the firing itself, was what happened next. Madison didn't just take my chair, she started erasing me. By the end of the first week, my name had been scrubbed from internal documentation. Project histories that I had written, maintained, and protected like gospel were now listed under Revised by M. Lang. The knowledge base articles I'd authored were either rewritten in a more accessible tone or archived completely. Someone updated the org chart to reflect Madison's new strategic vision, and you'd think she built the company out of mud and chewing gum the way the internal memos praised her fresh thinking. I watched all this unfold without touching a thing. Not yet. I had that old system access, sure, but I wasn't about to go nuclear over vanity. Not then. Instead, I just kept logging in quietly, reading the change logs, tracking the access points. I saw how they were using the back-end systems, poorly, mostly, with more reliance on automated processes than actual oversight. And I started noticing gaps. I saw where Madison's bright new strategy relied heavily on systems she didn't understand, processes she hadn't even been trained on because she never thought she needed to be. She had glossed over entire sections of infrastructure like they were obsolete relics instead of the glue holding the company together. One afternoon, I pulled up a ticket in the dev queue where one of the engineers, young guy named Devin I used to mentor, flagged a persistent redundancy issue in the back end. It was one of the scripts I'd built years ago to protect against simultaneous database writes. I read through his notes and felt my jaw clench. Instead of fixing the problem, Madison had told him to phase it out and trust the new architecture. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was textbook. A manager who didn't understand the scaffolding but was too proud to ask how the building stood up in the first place. Around this time, I started getting emails. Not official ones, of course, those were cut off, but personal messages from old teammates, people I'd worked with for years. Some just wanted to say thanks. Some were angry on my behalf. A few were nervous. One, from an old DevOps guy named Luis, simply read, "Things are falling apart already. Hope you're okay. This feels wrong." I didn't respond to any of them. Not because I didn't appreciate it, but because I didn't know what I could say that didn't sound petty or bitter. The truth was, I wasn't okay. I felt like someone had reached into my chest and yanked out 2 decades of meaning and then tossed it in a shredder without even looking at the contents. I had given them more than time. I had given them ideas, passion, loyalty. And now it was all being painted over in soft pastel colors and buzzwords. And worst of all, it was working. People were buying it. But what they didn't know, what Madison never bothered to learn, was that every one of those legacy systems still pinged an old admin script I'd buried in the architecture years ago for safety. It sent automated updates to a private logging server, one only I could see. And as I watched the frequency of errors rise, the number of overrides increase, and the ignored warnings pile up, I realized something that made my pulse settle for the first time in days. I didn't need to rewrite history. I just needed to wait for theirs to catch up. It's a strange thing, watching someone try to take credit for your life's work while also dismantling it in real time. Like watching someone steal your car and drive it off a cliff because they never learned how to use the clutch. Madison thought she could build a new legacy by erasing mine. But you can't erase what's still watching, still listening, still plugged into the heartbeat of the machine. Not when I wrote the damn heartbeat. And the funny thing about history, it has a way of surfacing when you least expect it, especially if you know exactly where it was buried. By the 3rd week, the company was already buckling under the weight of its own ambition, though from the outside, everything still looked polished and well-oiled, thanks to a flurry of press releases about strategic pivots and cloud-first initiatives. The truth, which only someone like me could see, was far less inspiring. Beneath the shiny new graphics and leadership quotes lay a system slowly unraveling, its foundations neglected, its operations held together with virtual duct tape. And I was watching it all unfold from the comfort of my home office, sipping coffee out of a company-branded mug they'd given me on my 15th work anniversary, as if a piece of cheap ceramic could ever capture what I'd built for them. I had always been methodical, never one to act on emotion alone, and certainly not the type to torch everything just because I'd been wronged. That wasn't how I operated. I knew better than to go full revenge fantasy. But I also knew systems, how they breathe, how they stretch, where they creak before they crack. I knew how to test the pressure points, and more importantly, I knew how to listen. The system I'd built, affectionately referred to by the dev team as the Beast, due to its complexity and tendency to rebel when mishandled, was still talking to me. Not in words, of course, but through logs, patterns, pings, and warnings that no one else noticed because no one else knew where to look. The first thing I did, after confirming my access still worked, was activate a hidden monitoring script that I'd originally written as a backup diagnostic tool during our big system migration 5 years ago. It was meant to detect and report unauthorized database queries, API call surges, memory leaks, and the sort of anomalies that could snowball into major outages. At the time, it had been a safeguard, something I tucked away out of habit, like a mechanic hiding a wrench in the glove box, just in case. Now, it was my eyes and ears behind enemy lines, and what it showed me over the next 2 weeks was nothing short of embarrassing. They were deploying untested code directly into production environments, bypassing review gates I had put in place for a reason. Madison's hand-picked agile transformation team had taken one look at the old workflows, declared them legacy thinking, and proceeded to ignore them entirely. The system was registering triple the expected API calls from customer portals, leading to latency spikes that went unaddressed. Critical overnight processes were failing silently because someone had muted the error logging notifications, assuming they were unnecessary noise. And the kicker? Several of the high-level dashboards, the ones the executive team used to make decisions, were still pulling data from a deprecated source table that hadn't been updated since I left. They were making decisions off of ghost data, and they didn't even know it. But the worst of it came when I stumbled across an internal email chain buried in a backup archive, a thread someone must have assumed had been deleted, but was, in fact, preserved by a system-level auto-archive I had set up long ago for compliance reasons. The thread included Madison, the CTO, and 3 board members. The subject line was a bland Q3 transition planning, but the contents made my blood run cold. In it, they discussed my removal as a necessary optics shift, referring to me not by name but as the legacy anchor, suggesting that while my contributions were appreciated, my continued presence made it difficult to justify forward-looking leadership narratives. Madison, in her characteristically professional tone, wrote, "We'll position the departure as a planned evolution. He'll go quietly. He's the type." They were right. I had gone quietly. I hadn't made a fuss, hadn't sent angry emails or tried to rally people to my side. I'd packed up my desk, smiled through the humiliation, and walked out with my dignity intact. But that didn't mean I was going to sit back and let them dismantle everything I'd built without consequence. That email thread wasn't just insulting. It was revealing. It showed their arrogance, their confidence in their plan, and most importantly, their complete ignorance of how much of the company still depended on systems they barely understood. So I started making a plan. Not to destroy, not to sabotage in the way people imagine when they think of revenge, but to expose. I wanted the truth to come out not through some dramatic act, but by letting their own decisions walk them into the fire. I began writing scripts, simple ones at first, designed to surface the problems they were causing. One script checked for misaligned data in their customer analytics reports and auto-sent an anonymous flag to the analytics team's internal forum. Another script generated anonymous bug tickets whenever a deprecated service was used improperly. Nothing traced back to me, but each one was a little whisper into the machine, guiding attention toward the cracks they were too busy posturing to notice. And it started to work. I watched internal chatter rise as teams scrambled to understand where the problems were coming from. I saw meetings being scheduled, urgent Slack threads lighting up with junior developers asking questions they should have been trained on before they were handed the keys. Madison, ever the optimist in public, kept pushing cheerful updates to the board about progress and innovation. But the panic was starting to show in the frequency of her internal check-ins. She was overcompensating, doubling down on confidence while the floor beneath her was starting to tremble.